Hey there, U.S. history class. We are now officially on our last unit, which is going to be the Cold War. So, today's lecture is going to go into what happens to the world and the U.S. right after World War II, and then also kind of give you a little bit of a preview of like what's going to be happening in the Cold War. So again, this is our last unit, so kind of exciting. We made it almost the entire way. So let's quickly recap what happens because I know that you had to read about the end of World War II, but I don't know if many of us read about the end of World War II or just, like didn't read it. So I'm going to kind of take you through the end of World War II with the US, the Soviet Union, and some of these other countries too. And then we'll jump into actually what happens like after World War II. So, like World War One, the U.S. joins World War Two pretty late in the game. They try to stay neutral because again they did not want to be involved in another world war, but eventually they get pulled in because of the Japan bombing the U.S. at Pearl Harbor. If you remember from the book, Japan basically does this to keep the U.S. out of the war. Their whole idea is if we hit them before they hit us and we get them hard enough, that they'll just, they already didn't really want to be in the war to begin with, so maybe this strike will just send them to say, hey, we don't want to be a part of this at all. Obviously, it backfires and the U.S. gets involved. Another big reason that the U.S. is very concerned and wants to get involved, especially in Europe, because obviously Japan is the one that attacked them. But the reason they want to get into Europe, or a big reason, is because the Soviet Union, Germany, had pushed their army into the Soviet Union after they signed their non-aggression pact. Once World War II actually started, the non-aggression pact didn't mean anything anymore. So when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, we talked about Stalingrad and Leningrad, these battles that the Soviet Union were able to actually win and push them back. As the Soviet Union was pushing Germany back into Europe, they were also going past and basically into France. And the US was very concerned that a communist country like the Soviet Union was going to take over all of Europe because France was obviously very weak from the war, the UK was very weak from the war, and they were afraid that the Soviet Union was going to keep pushing Germany all the way back here and then even push into France and take over the rest of this at the end of the war. So by the US coming in to help, they were basically able to end the war, and they kind of draw a line here, which we'll get into a little bit more when we get into the PowerPoint. Last thing we need to talk about World War II before we get into the what happens right after is the dropping the atomic bombs on Japan. So Truman authorizes the U.S. to drop the first atomic bomb on Japan. They're at Hiroshima and Nagasaki are the two cities that they'll bomb. They dropped the first one because Japan will not totally surrender. By totally surrender, the U.S. is saying that your government needs to step down and we need to put a new government in. From the U.S.'s perspective, this is a government that attacked us, so we don't want them in power anymore. From a Japanese perspective, it's like we've already lost the war. Can we at least just keep what government we have? So obviously these two perspectives don't really line up. Japan says, no, we will not totally surrender. So then the U.S. drops the bomb. After the second or after the first bomb, then they ask for total surrender again. Japan is very hesitant and basically is like, I don't think we want to do it. And they said the U.S. also, when they were coming up with the atomic bomb, they had two different ones, and so they wanted to test out both. So that's another reason for them wanting to drop the bomb on the second bomb on Japan. They did drop pamphlets down to them, and to try to like warn them that they were going to drop the bomb. It's kind of unfortunate that we're not all in school because there's a lot of like interesting clips from different movies that I have that I usually show during this. I'll try to see if I can get them up on Google Classroom, but it just shows like the devastation, like the when they drop the bomb, the light that comes out of the bomb is so bright that people's like shadows are like permanently etched into the cement. Anyway, getting back to this, so the U.S. was dropping these two atomic bombs on Japan. The U.S. was also trying to prove, especially to the Soviet Union, even though technically they were allies during World War II, They wanted to prove to the Soviet Union that, hey, look, we have these giant bombs. You better not mess with us. So, just a reminder that the UK, France, the US, and the Soviet Union were all on the same side during World War II because they wanted to defeat the Nazis. Once the Nazis are defeated, then the UK, France, and the US stay on the same team. But the Soviet Union is basically the only communist country, so the UK, France, and the US are going to basically gang up on the Soviet Union to keep them from spreading communism. Okay, at the top of your worksheets, there should be a secret word 1 and a secret word 2. For those, or for these secret words, basically, I'm just gonna like say a word. So like I'll say it at the end of like me explaining this, and then you'll write it for secret word 1, and then secret word 2 will be somewhere else in the lecture to try to make sure that you guys are actually listening to this. Because keep in mind they're on YouTube, so like it shows me like the average listening rate, and when the average listening rate's like only 2 minutes for a 14-minute lecture, I know that like we're not actually doing it. So the first word that we're going to use is gears, so Gears. That'll be the first word that you'll put up there. And now we are going to get started with the actual lecture. All right. So time period we're covering is 1945 to 1950. Again, this is kind of a general overview. This is going to give you some of the events that basically lead us up to the Cold War at its height. But again, we're talking about right after World War II, right after they signed their treaty. Okay, 4 questions we're going to look at today are: why did the Soviet and the U.S. ideologies, how did they lead to conflict after World War II? Ideologies being the way that obviously like you think about stuff. Second one is, how do we view Soviet actions towards the end of World War II? So how does the U.S. view how the Soviet Union acted towards the end of World War II? Third one, how did those actions shape our foreign policy? So just a reminder, foreign policy is how we interact with other countries. So we're going to look at how the Soviet Union, how based on what they did, it's going to affect the way that we interact with other countries. And then the last one, what you should be able to describe the U.S.'s foreign policy after World War II. All right, so Cold War, which countries are going to be involved? So after World War II, we have a lot of countries that fall to communism. Obviously not a country, it's an area, but Eastern Europe. So basically all the countries that are located right next to the Soviet Union. You'll see a map in a second. Those are going to follow communism. China, one of the largest, has one of the largest populations, is going to fall to communism. North Korea is going to fall to communism. Obviously, North Korea is still, it technically claims to be communist, but not really anymore. It's very complicated. I mean, who even knows if their leader is still alive right now or not? And then the last one, Vietnam. And obviously, some of you know that the U.S. is going to get involved in Vietnam. We'll see if we get to that this year, but we might end like right around Vietnam era, which is 1960s. Okay, so here's a map. All these orange or red countries are countries that are going to fall to communism. So basically, you can see that it's the East versus the West. So U.S., Great Britain, France, like these are going to be the key capitalist countries. Soviet Union, China, and then its satellite countries, which we'll talk about in a second. These are going to be the key ones for communism. So you can definitely see that the U.S. would be concerned that it's spreading, especially when it spreads to Cuba, but we might not be able to get to that this year. Okay, so keep in mind this word perspective. We're looking at the U.S.'s perspective. This isn't like necessarily facts. This is how the U.S. Interprets these communist countries. So from the U.S.'s perspective, they would say that communism is an economic system that denies basic human rights. They say you don't have as many freedoms under capitalism. Under communism, they want to kind of make sure that everyone, like, from the U.S.'s perspective, like everyone will just, get a job from the government. And the U.S. would say that's wrong. You should be free to choose whatever job you want. Also, they would say that people should be able to freely choose their own government, and basically saying that even though they don't say you could, they say this, but they don't necessarily act in this way, because places that fall to communism, the U.S. is going to like fund money to try to overthrow them, which really isn't saying you're free to choose your own government. But again, this is their perspective. This is how they interpret things. And then the Soviet Union is not fulfilling promises that they made during World War II. So this is also upsetting them with the Soviet Union. Okay, flip it around, the Soviet Union's perspective. They fought in the entire World War II. They have more deaths than any other Allied nation combined. So the Soviet Union was part of the Allied forces, which was, U.S., France, Great Britain, those countries. If you take all those countries, you add up all their casualties, the Soviet Union still had more deaths than all of those countries combined. They also wanted $10 million from Germany at the end of World War II, but the rest of the Allied nations said no. From the Soviets' perspective, they were saying, you need to repay us for destroying our country. From the Allies' perspective, Great Britain, France, the US, they would say, we did this after World War I, and this helped lead us to World War II. So the last thing we're going to do is put a bunch of money that Germany has to pay. When they won't be able to pay it, then another dictator comes in. You know the cycle at this point. The Allied nations don't really want to open up a two-front war. They didn't necessarily help out the Soviet Union as much as the Soviet Union would have wanted them. In 1945, the Soviets do follow through and declare war on Japan. So they're like, hey, we did our part. The U.S. was saying, hey, if we're going to get involved, like the Soviet Union, you need to also help out with fighting Japan. So they do. And basically, just the Soviet Union feels like it fought most of World War II, and no one really helped it. And now at the end of World War II, everyone's basically attacking them. So they basically paid their dues. They basically said, hey, we did as much as we could for World War II. We did basically more than any other country did, and we never again want to be vulnerable, especially to Germany, because obviously Germany's invaded them twice within the last century. Okay, United States and USSR. USSR is just the abbreviation for the Soviet Union. It's just the Russian way of abbreviating it. Okay, so they both have a mutual fear and distrust for each other. They worked well when they were fighting a common enemy, the Nazis, but now that the Nazis are gone, they kind of just don't like each other. Because the Nazis were so bad, it's like you were able to team up with your enemy to take out someone who was even worse, but now that that person who's even worse is out, you now kind of you go back to not liking each other again. They both feel like they have spies in each other's countries. They both feel like each country is trying to take them down from inside, from the outside. One of them is going to, declare war on the other. There's just constant fear and mistrust between the two. During this Cold War, because this is why it's called a Cold War, there's no direct military conflict. So there will never be, during the Cold War, the U.S. declaring war on the Soviet Union. That will not happen. Soviet Union doesn't declare war on the U.S. There's no regular, World War II, countries declared war on each other, went to war. Cold War is not going to be fought this way. It's going to be more fought with, hey, I have better weapons than you, so you better not mess with me. I have a better economy than you, so it proves that my system is better. It's going to be fighting in every single way possible besides direct, one army standing on one side, one army standing on the other side, fighting each other. So yeah, they're going to fight each other with economic pressure, a lot of propaganda and subversion, a lot of propaganda, and nuclear intimidation once they develop nuclear bombs.